Chapter 17, Part 2 of Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason Justice. Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Volume 2 by John Foxe. Edited by William Byron Forbush. Chapter 17, Rise and Progress of the Protestant Religion in Ireland, with an account of the barbarous massacre of 1641. Part 2. In the barony of Tyrawley, the Papists, at the instigation of the friars, compelled above 40 English Protestants, some of whom were women and children, to the hard fate of either falling by the sword or of drowning in the sea. These, choosing the latter, were accordingly forced by the naked weapons of their inexorable persecutors into the deep, where, with their children in their arms, they waded up to their chins, and afterwards sunk down and perished together. In the castle of Liscool, upwards of 150 men, women, and children were all burnt together, and at the castle of Monea, not less than 100 were all put to the sword. Great numbers were also murdered at the castle of Tula, which was delivered up to Maguire on condition of having fair quarter. But no sooner had that base villain got possession of the place than he ordered his followers to murder the people, which was immediately done with the greatest cruelty. Many others were put to deaths of the most horrid nature, and such as could have been invented only by demons instead of men. Some of them were laid with the center of their backs on the axle-tree of a carriage, with their legs resting on the ground on one side, and their arms and head on the other. In this position, one of the savages scourged the wretched object on the thighs, legs, etc., while another set on furious dogs, who tore to pieces the arms and upper parts of the body, and in this dreadful manner were they deprived of their existence. Great numbers were fastened to horses' tails, and the beasts being set on full gallop by their riders, the wretched victims were dragged along until they expired. Others were hung on lofty gibbets, and a fire being kindled under them, they finished their lives, partly by hanging, and partly by suffocation. Nor did the more tender sex escape the least particle of cruelty that could be projected by their merciless and furious persecutors. Many women of all ages were put to death of the most cruel nature. Some, in particular, were fastened with their backs to strong posts, and being stripped to their waists, the inhuman monsters cut off their right breasts with shears, which, of course, put them to the most excruciating torments, and in this position they were left until, from the loss of blood, they expired. Such was the savage ferocity of these barbarians, that even unborn infants were dragged from the womb to become victims to their rage. Many unhappy mothers were hung naked in the branches of trees, and their bodies being cut open, the innocent offsprings were taken from them and thrown to the dogs and swine. And to increase the horrid scene, they would oblige the husband to be a spectator before suffering himself. At the town of Isencaith, they hanged above 100 Scottish Protestants, showing them no more mercy than they did to the English. Maguire, going to the castle of that town, desired to speak with the governor. When being admitted, he immediately burnt the records of the county, which were kept there. He then demanded £1,000 of the governor, which, having received, he immediately compelled him to hear Mass, and to swear that he would continue to do so. And to complete his horrid barbarities, he ordered the wife and children of the governor to be hanged before his face, besides massacring at least 100 of the inhabitants. Upward of 1,000 men, women, and children were driven in different companies to Portadown Bridge, which was broken in the middle, and there compelled to throw themselves into the water, and such as attempted to reach the shore were knocked on the head. In the same part of the country, at least 4,000 persons were drowned in different places. The inhuman Papists, after stripping them, drove them like beasts to the spot fixed on for their destruction, and if any, through fatigue or natural infirmities, were slack in their pace, they pricked them with their swords and pikes, and to strike terror on the multitude, they murdered some by the way. Many of these poor wretches, when thrown into the water, endeavored to save themselves by swimming to the shore, but their merciless persecutors prevented their endeavors taking effect by shooting them in the water. In one place, 140 English, after being driven for many miles stark naked, and in the most severe weather, were all murdered on the same spot, some being hanged, others burnt, some shot, and many of them burned alive, and so cruel were their tormentors that they would not suffer them to pray before they robbed them of their miserable existence. Other companies they took under the pretense of safe conduct, who from that consideration proceeded cheerfully on their journey, but when the treacherous papists had got them to a convenient spot, they butchered them all in the most cruel manner. 115 men, women, and children were conducted by order of Sir Phelim O'Neil to Portadown Bridge, where they were all forced into the river and drowned. One woman, named Campbell, finding no probability of escaping, suddenly clasped one of the chief papists in her arms, and held him so fast that they were both drowned together. In Kiliman they massacred 48 families, among whom 22 were burnt together in one house. The rest were either hanged, shot, or drowned. In Kilmore, the inhabitants, which consisted of about 200 families, all fell victims to their rage. Some of them sat in the stocks until they confessed where their money was, after which they put them to death. The whole county was one common scene of butchery, and many thousands perished in a short time, by sword, famine, fire, and others the most cruel deaths that rage and malice could invent. These bloody villains showed so much favor to some as to dispatch them immediately, but they would by no means suffer them to pray. Others they imprisoned in filthy dungeons, putting heavy bolts on their legs, and keeping them there until they were starved to death. At Kassel they put all the Protestants into a loathsome dungeon, where they kept them together for several weeks, in the greatest misery. At length they were released, when some of them were barbarously mangled, and left on the highways to perish at leisure. Others were hanged, and some were buried in the ground upright, with their heads above the earth, and the papists, to increase their misery, treating them with derision during their sufferings. In the country of Antrim they murdered 954 Protestants in one morning, and afterwards about 1,200 more in that county. At a town called Lingerie, they forced 24 Protestants into a house, and then setting fire to it, burned them together, counterfeiting their outcries in derision to the others. Among other acts of cruelty, they took 2 children belonging to an Englishwoman, and dashed out their brains before her face, after which they threw the mother into a river, and she was drowned. They served many other children in the like manner, to the great affliction of their parents, and the disgrace of human nature. In Kilkenny, all the Protestants, without exception, were put to death, and some of them in so cruel a manner as perhaps was never before thought of. They beat an Englishwoman with such savage barbarity that she had scarce a whole bone left, after which they threw her into a ditch. But not satisfied with this, they took her child, a girl of about 6 years of age, and after ripping its belly, threw it to its mother, there to languish until it perished. They forced one man to go to Mass, after which they ripped open his body, and in that manner left him. They sawed another asunder, cut the throat of his wife, and after having dashed out the brains of their child and infant, threw it to the swine, who greedily devoured it. After committing these and several other horrid cruelties, they took the heads of 7 Protestants, and among them that of a pious minister, all of which they fixed up at the market cross. They put a gag in the minister's mouth, then slit his cheeks to his ears, and laying a leaf of a Bible before it, bid him preach, for his mouth was wide enough. They did several other things by way of derision, and expressed the greatest satisfaction at having thus murdered and exposed the unhappy Protestants. It is impossible to conceive the pleasure these monsters took in exercising their cruelty, and to increase the misery of those who fell into their hands. When they butchered them, they would say, "Your soul to the devil!" One of these miscreants would come into a house, with his hands imbued in blood, and boast that it was English blood, and that his sword had pricked the white skins of the Protestants, even to the hilt. When any one of them had killed a Protestant, others would come and receive gratification in cutting and mangling the body, after which they left it exposed to be devoured by dogs. And when they had slain a number of them, they would boast that the devil was beholden to them for sending so many souls to hell. But it is no wonder they should thus treat the innocent Christians, when they hesitated not to commit blasphemy against God and His most holy word. In one place they burnt 2 Protestant Bibles, and then said they had burnt hellfire. In the church at Powerscourt they burnt the pulpit, pews, chests, and Bibles belonging to it. They took other Bibles, and after wetting them with dirty water, dashed them in the faces of the Protestants, saying, "We know you love a good lesson. Here is an excellent one for you. Come tomorrow, and you shall have as good a sermon as this." Some of the Protestants they dragged by the hair of their heads into the church, where they stripped and whipped them in the most cruel manner, telling them at the same time that if they came tomorrow, they should hear the like sermon. In Munster they put to death several ministers in the most shocking manner. One in particular they stripped stark naked, and driving him before them, pricked him with swords and darts until he fell down and expired. In some places they plucked out the eyes, and cut off the hands of the Protestants, and in that manner turned them into the fields, there to wander out their miserable existence. They obliged many young men to force their aged parents to a river, where they were drowned, wives to assist in the hanging of their husbands, and mothers to cut the throats of their children. In one place they compelled a young man to kill his father, and then immediately hanged him. In another they forced a woman to kill her husband, and then obliged the son to kill her, and afterwards shot him through the head. At a place called Glasgow, a popish priest, with some others, prevailed on 40 Protestants to be reconciled to the Church of Rome. They had no sooner done this than they told them they were in good faith, and that they would prevent their falling from it and turning heretics by sending them out of this world, which they did by immediately cutting their throats. In the county of Tipperary, upwards of 30 Protestants, men, women, and children, fell into the hands of the Papists, who, after stripping them naked, murdered them with stones, pole axes, swords, and other weapons. In the county of Mayo, about 60 Protestants, 15 of whom were ministers, were, upon covenant, to be safely conducted to Galway by one Edmund Burke and his soldiers, but that inhuman monster by the way drew his sword, as an intimation of his design to the rest, who immediately followed his example and murdered the whole, some of whom they stabbed, others were run through the body with pikes, and several were drowned. In Queen's County, great numbers of Protestants were put to the most shocking deaths. 50 or 60 were placed together in one house, which, being set on fire, they all perished in the flames. Many were stripped naked, and being fastened to horses by ropes placed around their middles, were dragged through bogs until they expired. Some were hung by the feet to tenor-hooks driven into poles, and then in that wretched posture left until they perished. Others were fastened to the trunk of a tree, with a branch at the top. Over this branch hung one arm, which principally supported the weight of the body, and one of the legs was turned up and fastened to the trunk, while the other hung straight. In this dreadful and uneasy posture did they remain as long as life would permit, pleasing spectacles to their bloodthirsty persecutors. At Clowns, 17 men were buried alive. An Englishman, his wife, 5 children, and a servant maid were all hanged together, and afterward thrown into a ditch. They hung many by the arms to the branches of trees, with a weight to their feet, and others by the middle, in which posture they left them until they expired. Several were hanged on windmills, and before they were half dead, the barbarians cut them in pieces with their swords. Others, both men, women, and children, they cut and hacked in various parts of their bodies, and left them wallowing in their blood to perish where they fell. One poor woman they hanged on a gibbet, with her child, an infant about a 12-month-old, the latter of whom was hanged by the neck with the hair of its mother's head, and in that manner finished its short but miserable existence. In the county of Tyrone, no less than 300 Protestants were drowned in one day, and many others were hanged, burned, and otherwise put to death. Dr. Maxwell, rector of Tyrone, lived at this time near Armagh, and suffered greatly from these merciless savages. This person, in his examination, taken upon oath before the king's commissioners, declared that the Irish Papists owned to him that they, at several times, had destroyed in one place 12,000 Protestants, whom they inhumanly slaughtered at Glenwood in their flight from the county of Armagh. As the river Bann was not fordable, and the bridge broken down, the Irish forced thither at different times a great number of unarmed defenseless Protestants, and with pikes and swords violently thrust about 1,000 into the river, where they miserably perished. Nor did the cathedral of Armagh escape the fury of those barbarians, it being maliciously set on fire by their leaders, and burnt to the ground. And to extirpate, if possible, the very race of those unhappy Protestants who lived in or near Armagh, the Irish first burnt all their houses, and then gathered together many hundreds of those innocent people, young and old, on pretense of allowing them a guard and safe conduct to Coleraine, when they treacherously fell on them by the way, and inhumanly murdered them. The like horrid barbarities with those we have particularized were practiced on the wretched Protestants in almost all parts of the kingdom, and when an estimate was afterward made of the number who were sacrificed to gratify diabolical souls of the Papists, it amounted to 150,000. But it now remains that we proceed to the particulars that followed. These desperate wretches, flushed and grown insolent with success, though by methods attended with such excessive barbarities as perhaps not to be equaled, soon got possession of the castle of Newry, where the king's stores and ammunition were lodged, and, with as little difficulty, made themselves masters of Dundalk. They afterward took the town of Ardee, where they murdered all the Protestants, and then proceeded to Drogheda. The garrison of Drogheda was in no condition to sustain a siege, notwithstanding which, as often as the Irish renewed their attacks, they were vigorously repulsed by a very unequal number of the king's forces, and a few faithful Protestant citizens under Sir Henry Tichborne, the governor, assisted by the Lord Viscount More. The siege of Drogheda began on the 30th of November, 1641, and held until the 4th of March, 1642, when Sir Phelim O'Neil and the Irish miscreants under him were forced to retire. In the meantime, 10,000 troops were sent from Scotland to the remaining Protestants in Ireland, which, being properly divided in the most capital parts of the kingdom, happily eclipsed the power of the Irish savages, and the Protestants for a time lived in tranquillity. In the reign of James II, they were again interrupted, for in a parliament held at Dublin in the year 1689, great numbers of the Protestant nobility, clergy, and gentry of Ireland were attainted of high treason. The government of the kingdom was, at that time, invested in the Earl of Tyrconnell, a bigoted papist, and an inveterate enemy to the Protestants. By his orders they were again persecuted in various parts of the kingdom. The revenues of the city of Dublin were seized, and most of the churches converted into prisons. And had it not been for the resolution and uncommon bravery of the garrisons in the city of Londonderry and the town of Enniskillen, there had not one place remained for refuge to the distressed Protestants in the whole kingdom, but all must have been given up to King James, and to the furious popish party that governed him. The remarkable siege of Londonderry was opened on the 18th of April, 1689, by 20,000 papists, the flower of the Irish army. The city was not properly circumstanced to sustain a siege, the defenders consisting of a body of raw, undisciplined Protestants, who had fled thither for shelter, and half a regiment of Lord Mountjoy's disciplined soldiers, with the principal part of the inhabitants, making it only 7,361 fighting men. The besieged hoped, at first, that their stores of corn and other necessities would be sufficient, but by the continuance of the siege their wants increased, and these became at last so heavy that for a considerable time before the siege was raised, a pint of coarse barley, a small quantity of greens, a few spoonfuls of starch, with a very moderate proportion of horse flesh, were reckoned a week's provision for any soldier, and they were at length reduced to such extremities that they ate dogs, cats, and mice. Their miseries increasing with the siege, many, through mere hunger and want, pined and languished away or fell dead in the streets. And it is remarkable that when their long-expected succors arrived from England, they were upon the point of being reduced to this alternative, either to preserve their existence by eating each other, or attempting to fight their way through the Irish, which must have infallibly produced their destruction. These succours were most happily brought by the ship Mountjoy of Derry, and the Phoenix of Coleraine, at which time they had only 9 lean horses left, with a pint of meal to each man. By hunger and the fatigues of war, their 7,361 fighting men were reduced to 4,300, 1/4 a part of whom were rendered unserviceable. As the calamities of the besieged were great, so likewise were the terrors and sufferings of their Protestant friends and relations, all of whom, even women and children, were forcibly driven from the country 30 miles round, and inhumanly reduced to the sad necessity of continuing some days and nights without food or covering before the walls of the town, and were thus exposed to the continual fire both of the Irish army from without and the shots of their friends from within. But the succours from England happily arriving put an end to their affliction, and the siege was raised on the 31st of July, having been continued upwards of 3 months. The day before the siege of Londonderry was raised, the Inniskillers engaged a body of 6,000 Irish Roman Catholics at Newton, Butler, or Crown Castle, of whom near 5,000 were slain. This, with the defeat at Londonderry, dispirited the Papists, and they gave up all farther attempts to persecute the Protestants. The year following, 1690, the Irish took up arms in favor of the abdicated prince, King James II, but they were totally defeated by his successor, King William III. That monarch, before he left the country, reduced them to a state of subjection, in which they have ever since continued. But notwithstanding all this, the Protestant interest at present stands upon a much stronger basis than it did a century ago. The Irish, who formerly led an unsettled and roving life in the woods, bogs, and mountains, and lived on the depredation of their neighbors, they who, in the morning, seized the prey, and at night divided the spoil, have, for many years past, become quiet and civilized. They taste the sweets of English society, and the advantages of civil government. They trade in our cities, and are employed in our manufactories. They are received also into English families, and treated with great humanity by the Protestants. End of chapter 17. Recording by Jason Justice.
Chapter 18 of Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Berceau. Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Volume 2 by John Foxe, edited by William Byron Forbush. Chapter 18, The Rise, Progress, Persecutions, and Sufferings of the Quakers. In treating of these people in a historical manner, we are obliged to have recourse to much tenderness. That they differ from the generality of Protestants in some of the capital points of religion cannot be denied. And yet, as Protestant dissenters, they are included under the description of the Toleration Act. It is not our business to inquire whether people of similar sentiments had any existence in the primitive ages of Christianity. Perhaps in some respects they had not, but we are to write of them not as what they were, but what they now are. That they have been treated by several writers in a very contemptuous manner is certain. That they did not deserve such treatment is equally certain. The appellation Quakers was bestowed upon them as a term of reproach, and consequent of their apparent convulsions which they labored under when they delivered their discourses, because they imagined they were the effect of divine inspiration. It is not our business at present to inquire whether the sentiments of these people are agreeable to the gospel, but this much is certain, that the first leader of them, as a separate body, was a man of obscure birth, who had his first existence in Leicestershire about the year 1624. In speaking of this man, we shall deliver our own sentiments in a historical manner, and joining these to what have been said by the friends themselves, we shall endeavor to furnish out a complete narrative. George Foxe was descended of honest and respected parents, who brought him up in the national religion. But from a child he appeared religious, still, solid, and observing, beyond his years, and uncommonly knowing in divine things. He was brought up to husbandry and other country business, and was particularly inclined to the solitary occupation of a shepherd, an employment that very well suited his mind in several respects, both for its innocency and its solitude, and was a just emblem of his after ministry and service. In the year 1646, he entirely forsook the national church, in whose tenets he had been brought up, as before observed, and in 1647 he travelled into Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, without any set purpose of visiting particular places, but in a solitary manner he walked through several towns and villages, which way soever his mind turned. He fasted much, said Swell, and walked often in retired places with no other companion than his Bible. He visited the most retired and religious people in those parts, says Penn, and some there were, short of few, if any, in this nation, who waited for the consolation of Israel night and day, as Zacharias, Anna, and Simeon did of old time. To these he was sent, and these he sought out in the neighboring counties, and among them he sojourned until his more ample ministry came upon him. At this time he taught, and was an example of silence, endeavoring to bring them from self-performances, testifying of and turning them to the light of Christ within them, and encouraging them to wait in patience, and to feel the power of it to stir in their hearts, that their knowledge and worship of God might stand in the power of an endless life, which was to be found in the light as it was obeyed in the manifestation of it in man. For in the Word was life, and that life is the light of men. Life in the Word, light in men, and life in men too, as the light is obeyed. The children of the light, living by the life of the Word, by which the Word begets them again to God, which is the generation and new birth, without which there is no coming into the kingdom of God, and to which whoever comes is greater than John, that is, than John's dispensation, which was not that of the kingdom, but the consummation of the legal and forerunning of the gospel times, the time of the kingdom. Accordingly, several meetings were gathering in those parts, and thus his time was employed for some years. In the year 1652, he had a visitation of the great work of God in the earth, and of the way that he was to go forth in a public ministry to begin it. He directed his course northward, and in every place where he came, if not before he came to it, he had his particular exercise and service shown to him, so that the Lord was his leader indeed. He made great numbers of converts to his opinions, and many pious and good men joined him in his ministry. These were drawn forth especially to visit the public assemblies, to reprove, reform, and exhort them, sometimes in markets, fairs, streets, and by the highway side, calling people to repentance and to return to the Lord, with their hearts as well as their mouths, directing them to the light of Christ within them, to see, examine, and to consider their ways, by and to eschew the evil, and to do the good and acceptable will of God. They were not without opposition in the work they imagined themselves called to, being often set in the stocks, stoned, beaten, whipped, and imprisoned, though honest men of good report, that had left wives, children, houses, and lands, to visit them with a living call to repentance. But these coercive methods rather forwarded than abated their zeal, and in those parts they brought over many proselytes, and among them several magistrates and others of the better sort. They apprehended the Lord had forbidden them to pull off their hats to anyone, high or low, and required them to speak to the people without distinction, the language of thou and thee. They scrupled bidding people good morrow or good night, nor might they bend the knee to anyone, even in supreme authority. Both men and women went in a plain and simple dress, different from the fashion of the times. They neither gave nor accepted any titles of respect or honor, nor would they call any man master on earth. Several texts of Scripture they quoted in defense of these singularities, such as, "Swear not at all. How can ye believe which receive honor one of another, and seek not the honor that comes from God only?" etc. They placed the basis of religion in an inward light and an extraordinary impulse of the Holy Spirit. In 1654, their first separate meeting in London was held in the house of Robert Dring, in Watling Street, for by that time they spread themselves into all parts of the kingdom, and had in many places set up meetings or assemblies, particularly in Lancashire and the adjacent parts, but they were still exposed to great persecutions and trials of every kind. One of them, in a letter to the Protector, Oliver Cromwell, represents, though there are no penal laws in force obliging men to comply with the established religion, yet the Quakers are exposed upon other accounts. They are fined and imprisoned for refusing to take an oath, for not paying their tithes, for disturbing the public assemblies and meetings in the streets and places of public resort. Some of them have been whipped as vagabonds, and for their plain speeches to the magistrate. Under favor of the then toleration, they opened their meetings at the Bull and Mouth in Aldersgate Street, where women as well as men were moved to speak. Their zeal transported them to some extravagancies, which laid them still more open to the lash of their enemies, who exercised various severities upon them throughout the next reign. Upon the suppression of Venner's mad insurrection, the government, having published a proclamation forbidding the Anabaptists, Quakers, and Fifth Monarchy men to assemble or meet together under pretense of worshiping God, except it be in some parochial church, chapel, or in private houses, by consent of the persons there inhabiting, all meetings in other places being declared to be unlawful and riotous, etc. The Quakers thought it expedient to address the king thereon, which they did in the following words: "O King Charles, our desire is that thou mayest live forever in the fear of God and thy counsel. We beseech thee and thy counsel to read these following lines in tender bowels and compassion for our souls and for your good. And this consider, we are about 400 imprisoned in and about this city, of men and women from their families, besides in the county jails about 1,000. We desire that our meetings may not be broken up, but that all may come to a fair trial, that our innocence may be cleared up." Written London, 16th day, 11th month, 1660. On the 28th of the same month, they published the declaration referred to in their address, entitled, "A Declaration from the Harmless and Innocent People of God, called Quakers, against all sedition, plotters, and fighters in the world, for removing the ground of jealousy and suspicion from both magistrates and people in the kingdom concerning wars and fightings." It was presented to the king the 21st day of the 11th month, 1660, and he promised them upon his royal word that they should not suffer for their opinions as long as they lived peaceably. But his promises were very little regarded afterward. In 1661, they assumed courage to petition the House of Lords for a toleration of their religion, and for a dispensation from taking the oaths, which they held unlawful, not from any disaffection to the government, or a belief that they were less obliged by an affirmation, but from a persuasion that all oaths were unlawful, and that swearing upon the most solemn occasions was forbidden in the New Testament. Their petition was rejected, and instead of granting them relief, an act was passed against them, the preamble to which set forth, quote, "that whereas several persons have taken up an opinion that an oath, even before a magistrate, is unlawful and contrary to the word of God, and whereas under pretense of religious worship the said persons do assemble in great numbers in several parts of the kingdom, separating themselves from the rest of His Majesty's subjects and the public congregations and usual places of divine worship. Be it therefore enacted that if any such persons, after the 24th of March, 1661, shall refuse to take an oath when lawfully tendered, or persuade others to do it, or maintain in writing or otherwise the unlawfulness of taking an oath, or if they shall assemble for religious worship to the number of 5 or more, of the age of 15, they shall for the first offense forfeit £5, for the second £10, and for the third shall abjure the realm or be transported to the plantations, and the justice of peace at their open sessions may hear and finally determine in the affair." End quote. This act had a most dreadful effect upon the Quakers, though it was well known and notorious that these conscientious persons were far from sedition or disaffection to the government. George Foxe, in his address to the king, acquaints him that 3,068 of their friends had been imprisoned since His Majesty's restoration, that their meetings were daily broken up by men with clubs and arms, and their friends thrown into the water and trampled underfoot until the blood gushed out, which gave rise to their meeting in the open streets. A relation was printed, signed by 12 witnesses, which says that more than 4,200 Quakers were imprisoned, and of them 500 were in and about London and the suburbs, several of whom were dead in the jails. 600 of them, says an account published at that time, were in prison merely for religion's sake, of whom several were banished to the plantations. In short, the Quakers gave such full employment to the informers that they had less leisure to attend the meetings of other dissenters. Yet under all these calamities, they behaved with patience and modesty towards the government, and upon occasion of the Rye House plot in 1682, they thought it proper to declare their innocence of that sham plot in an address to the king, wherein, appealing to the searcher of all hearts, they say, quote, "Their principles do not allow them to take up defensive arms, much less to avenge themselves for the injuries they receive from others, that they continually pray for the king's safety and preservation, and therefore take this occasion humbly to beseech His Majesty to have compassion on their suffering friends, with whom the jails are so filled that they want air, to the apparent hazard of their lives, and to the endangering and infection in divers places. Besides, many houses, shops, barns, and fields are ransacked, and the goods, corn, and cattle swept away, to the discouraging trade and husbandry, and impoverishing great numbers of quiet and industrious people, and this for no other cause, but for the exercise of a tender conscience in the worship of Almighty God, who is sovereign Lord and King of men's consciences." End quote. On the accession of James II, they addressed that monarch honestly and plainly, telling him, quote, "We are come to testify our sorrow for the death of our good friend Charles, and our joy for thy being made our governor. We are told that thou art not of the persuasion of the Church of England, no more than we. Therefore we hope thou wilt grant us the same liberty which thou allowest thyself, which doing we wish thee all manner of happiness." End quote. When James, by his dispensing power, granted liberty to the dissenters, they began to enjoy some rest from their troubles, and indeed it was high time, for they were swelled to an enormous amount. They, the year before this, to them one of glad release, in a petition to James for a cessation of their sufferings, set forth, quote, that of late above 1,500 of their friends, both men and women, and that now there remain 1,383, of which 200 are women, many under sentence of praemunire, and more than 300 near it, for refusing the oath of allegiance, because they could not swear. 350 have died in prison since the year 1680. In London, the jail of Newgate has been crowded within these 2 years, sometimes with near 20 in a room, whereby several have been suffocated, and others who have been taken out sick have died of malignant fevers within a few days. Great violences, outrageous distresses, and woeful havoc and spoil have been made upon people's goods and estates by a company of idle, extravagant, and merciless informers, by persecutions on the Conventicle Act, and others also on quitem writs, and on other processes, for £20 a month, and 2/3 of their estates seized for the king. Some had not a bed to rest on, others had no cattle to till the ground, nor corn for food or bread, nor tools to work with. The said informers and bailiffs in some places breaking into houses and making great waste and spoil under pretense of serving the king and the church. Our religious assemblies have been charged at common law with being rioters and disturbers of the public peace, whereby great numbers have been confined in prison without regard to age, and many confined to holes and dungeons. The seizing for £20 a month has amounted to many thousands, and several who have employed some hundreds of poor people in manufactures are disabled to do so anymore by reason of long imprisonment. They spare neither widow nor fatherless, nor have they so much as a bed to lie on. The informers are both witnesses and prosecutors, to the ruin of great numbers of sober families. And justices of the peace have been threatened with the forfeiture of £100 if they do not issue out warrants upon their informations." End quote. With this petition, they presented a list of their friends in prison in the several counties, amounting to 460. During the reign of King James II, these people were, through the intercession of their friend Mr. Penn, treated with greater indulgence than ever they had had before. They were now become extremely numerous in many parts of the country, and the settlement of Pennsylvania taking place soon after, many of them went over to America. There they enjoyed the blessings of a peaceful government and cultivated the arts of honest industry. As the whole colony was the property of Mr. Penn, so he invited people of all denominations to come and settle with him. A universal liberty of conscience took place, and in this new colony the natural rights of mankind were for the first time established. These friends are in the present age a very harmless, inoffensive body of people, but of that we shall take more notice hereafter. By their wise regulations, they not only do honor to themselves, but they are of vast service to the community. It may be necessary here to observe that as the Friends, commonly called Quakers, will not take an oath in a court of justice, so their affirmation is permitted in all civil affairs. But they cannot prosecute a criminal because in the English courts of justice, all evidence must be upon oath. An account of the persecution of the Friends, commonly called Quakers, in the United States. About the middle of the 17th century, much persecution and sufferings were inflicted on a sect of Protestant dissenters commonly called Quakers, a people which arose at the time in England, some of whom sealed their testimony with their blood. For an account of the above people, see Sewell's or Goe's history of them. The principal points upon which their conscientious nonconformity rendered them obnoxious to the penalties of the law were 1. The Christian resolution of assembling publicly for the worship of God in a manner most agreeable to their consciences. 2. Their refusal to pay tithes, which they esteemed a Jewish ceremony, abrogated by the coming of Christ. 3. Their testimony against wars and fighting, the practice of which they judged inconsistent with the command of Christ. Love your enemies, Matthew 5:44. 4. Their constant obedience to the command of Christ, swear not at all, Matthew 5:34. 5. Their refusal to pay rates or assessments for buildings and repairing houses for a worship which they did not approve. 6. Their use of the proper and scriptural language, thou and thee, to a single person, and their disuse of the custom of uncovering their heads or pulling off their hats by way of homage to man. 7. The necessity many found themselves under of publishing what they believed to be the doctrine of truth, and sometimes even in the places appointed for the public national worship. Their conscientious non-compliance in the preceding particulars exposed them to much persecution and suffering, which consisted in prosecutions, fines, cruel beatings, whippings, and other corporal punishments, imprisonment, banishment, and even death. To relate a particular account of their persecutions and sufferings would extend beyond the limits of this work. We shall therefore refer for that information to the histories already mentioned, and more particularly to Bess's collection of their sufferings. And we shall confine our account here mostly to those who sacrificed their lives and evinced by their disposition of mind, constancy, patience, and faithful perseverance, that they were influenced by a sense of religious duty. Numerous and repeated were the persecutions against them, and sometimes for transgressions or offenses which the law did not contemplate or embrace. Many of the fines and penalties exacted of them were not only unreasonable and exorbitant, but as they could not consistently pay them, were sometimes distrained to several times the value of the demand, whereby many poor families were greatly distressed and obliged to depend on the assistance of their friends. Numbers were not only cruelly beaten and whipped in a public manner like criminals, but some were branded and others had their ears cut off. Great numbers were long confined in loathsome prisons, in which some ended their days in consequence thereof. Many were sentenced to banishment, and a considerable number were transported. Some were banished on pain of death, and 4 were actually executed by the hands of the hangman, as we shall here relate, after inserting copies of some of the laws of the country where they suffered. At a general court held at Boston, the 14th of October, 1656, quote, "Whereas there is a cursed sect of heretics, lately risen up in the world, which are commonly called Quakers, who take upon them to be immediately sent from God, and infallibly assisted by the Spirit, to speak and write blasphemous opinions, despising government and the order of God in the church and commonwealth, speaking evil of dignities, reproaching and reviling magistrates and ministers, seeking to turn the people from the faith and gain proselytes to their pernicious ways. This court, taking into consideration the premises, and to prevent the like mischief as by their means is wrought in our land, doth hereby order, and by authority of this court, be it ordered and enacted, that what master or commander of any ship, bark, pink, or ketch shall henceforth bring into any harbor, creek, or cove within this jurisdiction any Quaker or Quakers or other blasphemous heretics, shall pay or cause to be paid the fine of 100 pounds to the treasurer of the country, except it appear he want true knowledge or information of their being such. And in that case he has liberty to clear himself by his oath, when sufficient proof to the contrary is wanting, and for default of good payment or good security for it, shall be cast into prison, and there to continue until the said sum be satisfied to the treasurer as aforesaid. And the commander of any ketch, ship, or vessel being legally convicted shall give in sufficient security to the governor, or any one or more of the magistrates who have power to determine the same, to carry them back to the place whence he brought them. And on his refusal so to do, the governor, or one or more of the magistrates, are hereby empowered to issue out his or their warrants to commit such master or commander to prison, there to continue until he give in sufficient security to the contentment of the governor or any of the magistrates as aforesaid. And it is hereby further ordered and enacted that what Quaker soever shall arrive in this country from foreign parts, or shall come into this jurisdiction from any parts adjacent, shall be forthwith committed to the house of correction, and at their entrance to be severely whipped, and by the master thereof be kept constantly to work, and none suffered to converse or speak with them during the time of their imprisonment, which shall be no longer than necessity requires. And it is ordered, if any person shall knowingly import into any harbor of this jurisdiction any Quaker's books or writings concerning their devilish opinions, shall pay for such book or writing, being legally proved against him or them, the sum of £5. And whoever shall disperse or conceal any such book or writing, and it be found with him or her, or in his or her house, and shall not immediately deliver the same to the next magistrate, shall forfeit or pay £5 for the dispersing or concealing of any such book or writing. And it is further enacted that if any persons within this colony shall take upon them to defend the heretical opinions of the Quakers, or any of their books or papers, shall be fined for the first time 40 shillings. If they shall persist in the same and shall again defend it, the second time £4. If notwithstanding they again defend and maintain the said Quakers' heretical opinions, they shall be committed to the house of correction until there be convenient passage to send them out of the land, being sentenced by the court of assistance to banishment. Lastly, it is hereby ordered that what person or persons soever shall revile the persons of the magistrates or ministers, as is usual with the Quakers, such person or persons shall be severely whipped or pay the sum of £5. This is a true copy of the court's order, as attests Edward Rawson, Secretary. End quote. At a general court held at Boston the 14th of October, 1657, quote, as an addition to the late order, in reference to the coming or bringing of any of the cursed sect of the Quakers into this jurisdiction, it is ordered that whosoever shall from henceforth bring or cause to be brought, directly or indirectly, any known Quaker or Quakers or other blasphemous heretics into this jurisdiction, every such person shall forfeit the sum of £100 to the country, and shall by warrant from any magistrate be committed to prison, there to remain until the penalty be satisfied and paid. And if any person or persons within this jurisdiction shall henceforth entertain and conceal any such Quaker or Quakers or other blasphemous heretics, knowing them so to be, every such person shall forfeit to the country 40 shillings for every hour's entertainment and concealment of any Quaker or Quakers, as aforesaid, and shall be committed to prison as aforesaid, until the forfeiture be fully satisfied and paid. And it is further ordered that if any Quaker or Quakers shall presume, after they have once suffered what the law requires, to come into this jurisdiction, every such male Quaker shall for the first offense have one of his ears cut off, and be kept at work in the house of correction, until he can be sent away at his own charge, and for the second offense shall have his other ear cut off. And every woman Quaker that has suffered the law here, that shall presume to come into this jurisdiction, shall be severely whipped and kept at the house of corrections at work, until she be sent away at her own charge. And so also for her coming again, she shall be alike used as aforesaid. And for every Quaker, he or she, that shall a third time herein again offend, they shall have their tongues bored through with a hot iron, and be kept at the house of correction close to work, until they be sent away at their own charge. And it is further ordered that all and every Quaker arising from among ourselves shall be dealt with and suffer the like punishment as the law provides against foreign Quakers. Edward Rawson, Secretary. End quote. Another act, this one made at a general court held at Boston, the 20th of October, 1658. Quote, "Whereas there is a pernicious sect, commonly called Quakers, lately risen, who by word and writing have published and maintained many dangerous and horrid tenets, and do take upon them to change and alter the received laudable customs of our nation, in giving civil respects to equals or reverence to superiors, whose actions tend to undermine the civil government, and also to destroy the order of the churches by denying all established forms of worship and withdrawing from orderly church fellowship, allowed and approved by all orthodox professors of truth, and instead thereof, and in opposition thereto, frequently meeting by themselves, insinuating themselves into the minds of the simple, or such as are at least affected to the order and government of church and commonwealth, whereby divers of our inhabitants have been infected, notwithstanding all former laws made upon the experience of their arrogant and bold obtrusions, to disseminate their principles among us, prohibiting their coming into this jurisdiction. They have not been deferred from their impious attempts to undermine our peace and hazard our ruin. For prevention thereof, this court doth order and enact that any person or persons of the cursed sect of the Quakers, who is not an inhabitant of, but is found within this jurisdiction, shall be apprehended without warrant, where no magistrate is at hand, by any constable, commissioner, or select man, and conveyed from constable to the next magistrate, who shall commit the said person to close prison, there to remain without bail until the next court of assistance, where they shall have legal trial. And being convicted to be of the sect of the Quakers, shall be sentenced to banishment on pain of death. And that every inhabitant of this jurisdiction, being convicted to be of the aforesaid sect, either by taking up, publishing, or defending the horrid opinions of the Quakers, or the stirring up mutiny, sedition, or rebellion against the government, or by taking up their abusive and destructive practices, i.e., denying civil respect to equals and superiors, and withdrawing from the church assemblies, and instead thereof frequenting meetings of their own in opposition to our church order, adhering to or approving of any known Quaker and the tenets and practices of Quakers that are opposite to the orthodox received opinions of the godly, and endeavoring to disaffect others to civil government and church order, or condemning the practice and proceedings of this court against the Quakers, manifesting thereby their complying with those whose design is to overthrow the order established in church and state. Every such person, upon conviction before the said court of assistance in manner aforesaid, shall be committed to close prison for 1 month, and then, unless they choose voluntarily to depart this jurisdiction, shall give bond for their good behavior and appear at the next court. Continuing obstinate and refusing to retract and reform the aforesaid opinions, they shall be sentenced to banishment upon pain of death. And any one magistrate, upon information given him of any such person, shall cause him to be apprehended, and shall commit any such person to prison according to his discretion, until he came to trial as aforesaid." End quote. It appears there were also laws passed in both of the then colonies of New Plymouth and New Haven, and in the Dutch settlement at New Amsterdam, now New York, prohibiting the people called Quakers from coming into those places under severe penalties, in consequence of which some underwent considerable suffering. The first who were executed were William Robinson, merchant of London, and Marmaduke Stevenson, a countryman of Yorkshire. These, coming to Boston in the beginning of September, were sent for by the Court of Assistance, and there sentenced to banishment on pain of death. This sentence was passed also on Mary Dyer, mentioned hereafter, and Nicholas Davis, who were both at Boston. But William Robinson, being looked upon as a teacher, was also condemned to be whipped severely, and the constable was commanded to get an able man to do it. Then Robinson was brought into the street, and there stripped, and having his hands put through the holes of the carriage of a great gun, where the jailer held him, the executioner gave him 20 stripes with a 3-fold cord whip. Then he and the other prisoners were shortly after released and banished, as appears from the following warrant. Quote, "You are required by these presently to set at liberty William Robinson, Marmaduke Stevenson, Mary Dyer, and Nicholas Davis, who by an order of the court and council have been imprisoned because it appeared by their own confession, words, and actions that they are Quakers. Wherefore a sentence was pronounced against them to depart this jurisdiction on pain of death, and that they must answer it at their peril, if they or any of them, after the 14th of this month, September, are found within this jurisdiction or any part thereof." End quote. Signed Edward Rawson, Boston, September 12th, 1659. Though Mary Dyer and Nicholas Davis left that jurisdiction for that time, yet Robinson and Stevenson, though they departed the town of Boston, could not yet resolve, not being free in mind, to depart that jurisdiction, though their lives were at stake. And so they went to Salem and some places thereabouts to visit and build up their friends in the faith. But it was not long before they were taken and put again into prison at Boston, and chains locked to their legs. In the next month Mary Dyer returned also, and she stood before the prison, speaking with one Christopher Holden, who was come thither to inquire for a ship bound for England, whither he intended to go. She was also taken into custody. Thus they had now 3 persons who, according to their law, had forfeited their lives. And on the 20th of October these 3 were brought into court, where John Endicott and others were assembled. And being called to the bar, Endicott commanded the keeper to pull off their hats, and then said that they had made several laws to keep the Quakers from among them, and neither whipping, nor imprisoning, nor cutting off ears, nor banishment upon pain of death would keep them from among them. And further he said that he or they desired not the death of any of them, yet notwithstanding his following words without more ado were, "Give ear and hearken to your sentence of death." Sentence of death was also passed upon Marmaduke Stevenson, Mary Dyer, and William Edred. Several others were imprisoned, whipped, and fined. We have no disposition to justify the Pilgrims for these proceedings, but we think, considering the circumstances of the age in which they lived, their conduct admits of much palliation. The fathers of New England endured incredible hardships in providing for themselves a home in the wilderness, and to protect themselves in the undisturbed enjoyment of rights which they had purchased at so dear a rate. They sometimes adopted measures which, if tried by the more enlightened and liberal views of the present day, must at once be pronounced altogether unjustifiable. But shall they be condemned without mercy for not acting up to principles which were unacknowledged and unknown throughout the whole of Christendom? Shall they alone be held responsible for opinions and conduct which had become sacred by antiquity, and which were common to Christians of all other denominations? Every government then in existence assumed to itself the right to legislate in matters of religion, and to restrain heresy by penal statutes. This right was claimed by rulers, admitted by subjects, and is sanctioned by the names of Lord Bacon and Montesquieu, and many others equally famed for their talents and learning. It is unjust, then, to press upon one poor persecuted sect the sins of all Christendom. The fault of our fathers was the fault of the age, and though this cannot justify, it certainly furnishes an extenuation of their conduct. As well might you condemn them for not understanding and acting up to the principles of religious toleration. At the same time, it is but just to say that, imperfect as were their views of the rights of conscience, they were nevertheless far in advance of the age to which they belonged, and it is to them more than to any other class of men on earth the world is indebted for the more rational views that now prevail on the subject of civil and religious liberty. End of chapter 18. Recording by David Berceau, www.davidbercot.com.
Chapter 19 of Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Volume 2, by John Foxe, edited by William Byron Forbush. Chapter 19, An Account of the Life and Persecutions of John Bunyan. This great Puritan was born the same year that the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth. His home was Elstow, near Bedford, in England. His father was a tinker, and he was brought up to the same trade. He was a lively, likable boy, with a serious and almost morbid side to his nature. All during his young manhood he was repenting for the vices of his youth, and yet he had never been either a drunkard or immoral. The particular acts that troubled his conscience were dancing, ringing the church bells, and playing cat. It was while playing the latter game one day that "a voice did suddenly dart from heaven into my soul, which said, Wilt thou leave thy sins and go to heaven, or have thy sins and go to hell?" At about this time he overheard 3 or 4 poor women in Bedford talking, as they sat at the door in the sun. "Their talk was about the new birth, the work of God in the hearts. They were far above my reach." In his youth he was a member of the Parliamentary army for a year. The death of his comrade close beside him deepened his tendency to serious thoughts, and there were times when he seemed almost insane in his zeal and penitence. He was at one time quite assured that he had sinned the unpardonable sin against the Holy Ghost. While he was still a young man he married a good woman who bought him a library of pious books, which he read with assiduity, thus confirming his earnestness and increasing his love of religious controversies. His conscience was still further awakened through the persecution of the religious body of Baptists, to whom he had joined himself. Before he was 30 years old he had become a leading Baptist preacher. Then came his turn for persecution. He was arrested for preaching without license. "Before I went down to the justice, I begged of God that his will be done, for I was not without hopes that my imprisonment might be an awakening to the saints in the country. Only in that matter did I commit the thing to God; and verily at my return I did meet my God sweetly in the prison." His hardships were genuine on account of the wretched condition of the prisons of those days. To this confinement was added the personal grief of being parted from his young and second wife and 4 small children, and particularly his little blind daughter. While he was in jail he was solaced by the 2 books which had been brought with him, the Bible and Foxe's Book of Martyrs. Although he wrote some of his early books during this long imprisonment, it was not until his second and shorter one, 3 years after the first, that he composed his immortal Pilgrim's Progress, which was published 3 years later. In an earlier tract he had thought briefly of the similarity between human life and a pilgrimage, and he now worked this theme out in fascinating detail, using the rural scenery of England for his background, the splendid city of London for his Vanity Fair, and the saints and villains of his own personal acquaintance for the finely drawn characters of his allegory. The Pilgrim's Progress is truly the rehearsal of Bunyan's own spiritual experiences. He himself had been the "man clothed in rags, with his face from his own house, a book in his hand, and a great burden upon his back." After he had realized that Christ was his righteousness, and that this did not depend on "the good frame of his heart," or, as we should say, on his feelings, "now did the chains fall off my legs indeed." His had been Doubting Castle and Sloughs of Despond, with much of the Valley of Humiliation and the Shadow of Death. But, above all, it is a book of victory. Once when he was leaving the doors of the courthouse where he himself had been defeated, he wrote, "As I was going forth of the doors, I had much ado to bear saying to them, that I carried the peace of God along with me." In his vision was ever the celestial city, with all its bells ringing. He had fought Apollyon constantly, and often wounded, shamed, and fallen, yet in the end, "more than conqueror through him that loved us." His book was at first received with much criticism from his Puritan friends, who saw in it only an addition to the worldly literature of his day, but there was not much then for Puritans to read, and it was not long before it was devoutly laid beside their Bibles and perused with gladness and with profit. It was perhaps 2 centuries later before literary critics began to realize that this story, so full of human reality and interest, and so marvelously modeled upon the English of the King James translation of the Bible, is one of the glories of English literature. In his later years he wrote several other allegories, of which one of them, the Holy War, it has been said that, "if the Pilgrim's Progress had never been written, it would be regarded as the finest allegory in the language." During the later years of his life Bunyan remained in Bedford as a venerated local pastor and preacher. He was also a favorite speaker in the nonconformist pulpits of London. He became so national a leader and teacher that he was frequently called Bishop Bunyan. In his helpful and unselfish personal life he was apostolic. His last illness was due to exposure upon a journey in which he was endeavoring to reconcile a father with his son. His end came on the 3rd of August, 1688. He was buried in Bunhill Fields, a churchyard in London. There is no doubt but that the Pilgrim's Progress has been more helpful than any other book but the Bible. It was timely, for they were still burning martyrs in Vanity Fair while he was writing. It is enduring, for while it tells little of living the Christian life in the family and community, it does interpret that life so far as it is an expression of the solitary soul, in homely language. Bunyan indeed "showed how to build a princely throne on humble truth." He has been his own Greatheart, dauntless guide to pilgrims, to many. Chapter 19. Of Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Volume 2, by John Foxe, edited by William Byron Forbush. Chapter 20. An Account of the Life of John Wesley. John Wesley was born on the 17th of June, 1703, in Epworth Rectory, England, the 15th of 19 children of Charles and Susanna Wesley. The father of Wesley was a preacher, and Wesley's mother was a remarkable woman in wisdom and intelligence. She was a woman of deep piety, and brought her little ones into close contact with the Bible stories, telling them from the tiles about the nursery fireplace. She also used to dress her children in their best, on the days when they were to have the privilege of learning their alphabet as an introduction to the reading of the Holy Scriptures. Young Wesley was a gay and manly youth, fond of games and particularly of dancing. At Oxford he was a leader, and during the latter part of his course there, was one of the founders of the Holy Club, an organization of serious-minded students. His religious nature deepened through study and experience, but it was not until several years after he left the university and came under the influence of Luther's writings that he felt that he had entered into the full riches of the gospel. He and his brother Charles were sent by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel to Georgia, where both of them developed their powers as preachers. Upon their passage they fell into the company of several Moravian brethren, members of the association recently renewed by the labors of Count Zinzendorf. It was noted by John Wesley in his diary that, in a great tempest, when the English people on board lost all self-possession, these Germans impressed him by their composure and entire resignation to God. He also marked their humility under shameful treatment. It was on his return to England that he entered into those deeper experiences and developed those marvelous powers as a popular preacher which made him a national leader. He was associated at this time also with George Whitefield, the tradition of whose marvelous eloquence has never died. What he accomplished borders upon the incredible. Upon entering his 85th year he thanked God that he was still almost as vigorous as ever. He ascribed it, under God, to the fact that he had always slept soundly, had risen for 60 years at 4 o'clock in the morning, and for 50 years had preached every morning at 5. Seldom in all his life did he feel any pain, care, or anxiety. He preached twice each day, and often thrice or 4 times. It has been estimated that he traveled every year 4,500 English miles, mostly upon horseback. The successes won by Methodist preaching had to be gained through a long series of years and amid the most bitter persecutions. In nearly every part of England it was met at the first by the mob with stones and peltings, with attempts at wounding and slaying. Only at times was there any interference on the part of the civil power. The two Wesleys faced all these dangers with amazing courage and with a calmness equally astonishing. What was more irritating was the heaping up of slander and abuse by the writers of the day. These books are now all forgotten. Wesley had been in his youth a high churchman and was always deeply devoted to the established communion. When he found it necessary to ordain preachers, the separation of his followers from the established body became inevitable. The name Methodist soon attached to them, because of the particular organizing power of their leader and the ingenious methods that he applied. The Wesley Fellowship, which after his death grew into the great Methodist Church, was characterized by an almost military perfection of organization. The entire management of his ever-growing denomination rested upon Wesley himself. The annual conference, established in 1744, acquired a governing power only after the death of Wesley. Charles Wesley rendered the society a service incalculably great by his hymns. They introduced a new era in the hymnology of the English Church. John Wesley apportioned his days to his work in leading the Church, to studying, for he was an incessant reader, to traveling, and to preaching. Wesley was untiring in his efforts to disseminate useful knowledge throughout his denomination. He planned for the mental culture of his traveling preachers and local exhorters, and for schools of instruction for the future teachers of the Church. He himself prepared books for popular use upon universal history, church history, and natural history. In this Wesley was an apostle of the modern union of mental culture with Christian living. He published also the best matured of his sermons and various theological works. These, both by their depth and their penetration of thought, and by their purity and precision of style, excite our admiration. John Wesley was of but ordinary stature, and yet of noble presence. His features were very handsome, even in old age. He had an open brow, an eagle nose, a clear eye, and a fresh complexion. His manners were fine, and in choice company with Christian people he enjoyed relaxation. Persistent, laborious love for men's souls, steadfastness, and tranquillity of spirit were his most prominent traits of character. Even in doctrinal controversies he exhibited the greatest calmness. He was kind and very liberal. His industry has been named already. In the last 52 years of his life it is estimated that he preached more than 40,000 sermons. Wesley brought sinners to repentance throughout 3 kingdoms and over 2 hemispheres. He was the bishop of such a diocese as neither the Eastern nor the Western Church ever witnessed before. What is there in the circle of Christian effort, foreign missions, home missions, Christian tracts and literature, field preaching, circuit preaching, Bible readings, or aught else, which was not attempted by John Wesley, which was not grasped by his mighty mind through the aid of his divine leader? To him it was granted to arouse the English Church when it had lost sight of Christ the Redeemer to a renewed Christian life. By preaching the justifying and renewing of the soul through belief upon Christ, he he lifted many thousands of the humbler classes of the English people from their exceeding ignorance and evil habits, and made them earnest, faithful Christians. His untiring effort made itself felt not in England alone, but in America and in continental Europe. Not only the germs of almost all the existing zeal in England on behalf of Christian truth and life are due to Methodism, but the activity stirred up in other portions of Protestant Europe we must trace indirectly at least to Wesley. He died in 1791 after a long life of tireless labor and unselfish service. His fervent spirit and hearty brotherhood still survives in the body that cherishes his name. End of chapter 20.
One of Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Caron. Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Volume 2 by John Foxe. Edited by William Byron Forbush, Chapter 21. Persecutions of the French Protestants in the south of France during the years 1814 and 1820, Part 1. The persecution in this Protestant part of France continued with very little intermission from the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by Louis XVI until a very short period previous to the commencement of the late French Revolution in the year 1785. M. Ribaut Saint Etienne and the celebrated M. de Lafayette were among the first persons who interested themselves, with the court of Louis XVI, in removing the scourge of persecution from this injured people, the inhabitants of the south of France. Such was the opposition on the part of the Catholics and the courtiers, that it was not until the end of the year 1790 that the Protestants were freed from their alarms. Previously to this, the Catholics at Nismes in particular had taken up arms. Nismes then presented a frightful spectacle. Armed men ran through the city, fired from the corners of the streets, and attacked all they met with swords and forks. A man named Astuc was wounded and thrown into the aqueduct. Baudon fell under the repeated strokes of bayonets and sabres, and his body was also thrown into the water. Bocher, a very young man, only 17 years of age, was shot as he was looking out of the window. 3 electors wounded, one dangerously, another elector wounded, only escaped death by repeatedly declaring he was a Catholic. A third received 4 sabre wounds, and was taken home dreadfully mangled. The citizens that fled were arrested by the Catholics upon the roads, and obliged to give proofs of their religion before their lives were granted. M. and Madame Vogue were at their country house, which the zealots broke open, where they massacred both, and destroyed their dwelling. M. Blatcher, a Protestant, 70 years of age, was cut to pieces with a sickle. Young Pierre, carrying some food to his brother, was asked, "Catholic or Protestant?" "Protestant," being the reply. A monster fired at the lad, and he fell. One of the murderer's companions said, "You might as well have killed a lamb." "I have sworn," replied he, "to kill 4 Protestants for my share, and this will count for 1. However, as these atrocities provoked the troops to unite in defense of the people, a terrible vengeance was retailed upon the Catholic party that had used arms, which, with other circumstances, especially the toleration exercised by Napoleon Bonaparte, keep them down completely until the year 1814, when the unexpected return of the ancient government rallied them all once more round the old banners." The arrival of King Louis XVIII at Paris. This was known at Nismes on the 13th of April, 1814. In a quarter of an hour the white cockade was seen in every direction. The white flag floated on the public buildings, on the splendid monuments of antiquity, and even on the Tower of Mange. Beyond the city walls, the Protestants, whose commerce had suffered materially during the war, were among the first to unite in the general joy. and to send in their adhesion to the Senate and the legislative body, and several of the Protestant departments sent addresses to the throne. But unfortunately M. Froment was again at Nismes at the moment, when many bigots being ready to join him. The blindness and fury of the 16th century rapidly succeeded the intelligence and philanthropy of the 19th. A line of distinction was instantly traced between men of different religions' opinions. The spirit of the old Catholic Church was again to regulate each person's share of esteem and safety. The difference of religion was now to govern anything else, and even Catholic domestics who had served Protestants with zeal and affection began to neglect their duties, or to perform them ungraciously and with reluctance. At the fetes and spectacles that were given at the public expense, the absence of the Protestants was charged on them as a proof of their disloyalty, and in the midst of the cries of Vive le Roi, the discordant sounds of Abbas le Maire, down with the Maire, were heard. M. Castleton was a Protestant. He appeared in public with the perfect M. Rouland, a Catholic, when potatoes were thrown at him, and the people declared that he ought to resign his office. The bigots of Nismes even succeeded in procuring an address to be presented to the king, stating that there ought to be in France but one God, one king, and one faith. In this that they were imitated by the Catholics of several towns. The history of the Silver Child. About this time M. Baron, councillor of the Cour Royal of Nismes, formed the plan of dedicating to God a silver child, if the Duchess d'Angoulême would give a prince to France. This project was converted into a public religious vow, which was the subject of conversation both in public and private, whilst persons whose imaginations were inflamed by these proceedings ran about the streets crying, Vivent des Bourbons, or the Bourbons forever. In consequence of this superstitious frenzy, it is said that Elias women were advised and instigated to poison their Protestant husbands, and at length it was found convenient to accuse them of political crimes. They could no longer appear in public without insults and injuries. When the mobs met with Protestants, they seized him, and they danced around them with barbarous joy, and amidst repeated cries of Vive le Roi, they sang verses, the burden of which was, We will wash our hands in Protestant blood, and make black puddings of the blood of Calvin's children. The citizens who came to the promenades for air and refreshment from the close and dirty streets were chased with shouts of Vive le Roi, as if those shouts were to justify every excess. If Protestants referred to the Charter, they were directly assured it would be of no use to them, and that they had only been managed to be more effectually destroyed. Persons of rank were heard to say in the public streets, All the Huguenots must be killed. This time their children must be killed, that none of the accursed race may remain. Still it is true. They were not murdered, but cruelly treated. Protestant children could no longer mix in the sports of Catholics, and were not even permitted to appear without their parents. At dark, their families shut themselves up in their apartments, but even then stones were thrown against their windows. When they arose in the mountain, it was not uncommon to find gibbets drawn on their doors or walls, and in the streets the Catholics held cords, already soaked before their eyes, and pointed out instruments by which they hoped and designed to exterminate them. Small gallows or models were handled about, and a man who lived opposite to one of their pastors exhibited one of these models in his window and made signs sufficiently intelligible. When the minister passed, a figure representing a Protestant preacher was also hung up on the public crossway, and the most atrocious songs were sung under his window. Towards the conclusion of the carnival, a plan that had even been formed to make a caricature of the 4 ministers of the place and burn them in effigy. But this was prevented by the Major of Nimes, a Protestant. A dreadful song presented to the prefect in every country, in the country dialect with a false translation, was printed by his approval, and had a great run before he saw the extent of the roar into which he had been betrayed. The 63rd Regiment of the line was publicly censured and insulted, for having, according to order, protected Protestants. In fact, The Protestants seemed to be as sheep destined for the slaughter. The Catholic arms at Beauclair in May 1815, a federative association similar to that of Lyons, Grenoble, Paris, Avignon, and Montpellier, was desired by many persons at Nimes, but this federation terminated here after an ephemeral and illusory existence of 14 days. In the meanwhile, a large party of Catholic zealots were in arms at Beauclair, and who soon published their patrols so near the walls of Nimes, so as to alarm the inhabitants. These Catholics appealed to the English off Marseilles for assistance, and obtained the grant of 1,000 muskets, 10,000 cartouches, etc. General Gilly, however, was soon sent against these partisans, who prevented them from coming to extremes by granting them an armistice. And yet when Louis XVIII had returned to Paris, after the expiration of Napoleon's reign of 100 days in peace, and party spirit seemed to have been subdued, even at Nimes, bands from Beauclair joined Trestalion in the city, to glut the vengeance they had so long premeditated. General Gilly had left the department several days. The troops of the line left behind had taken the White Cockade, and waited further orders, whilst the new commissioners had only to proclaim the cessation of hostilities, and the complete establishment of the king's authority. In vain. No commissioners appeared, no dispatches arrived to calm and regulate the public mind. But towards evening the advance guard of the banditti, to the amount of several hundreds, entered the city, undesired but unopposed. As they marched without order or discipline, covered with clothes or rags of all colors, decorated with cockades, not white, but white and green, armed with muskets, sabres, forks, pistols, and reaping hooks, intoxicated with wine and stained with the blood of the Protestants, whom they had murdered on their road, they presented a most hideous and appealing spectacle in the open place in front of the barracks. This banditti was joined by the city armed mob, headed by Jacques Dupont, commonly called Trestalion. To save the effusion of blood, this garrison of about 500 men consented to capitulate, and marched out sad and defenseless. But when about 50 had passed, the rabble commenced a tremendous confiding and unprotected victims. Nearly all were killed or wounded, but very few could re-enter the yard before the garrison gates were again closed. These were again forced in an instant, and all were massacred who could not climb over roofs or leap into adjoining gardens. In a word, death met them in every place and in every shape, and this Catholic massacre revelled in cruelty, and surpassed the treachery, the crimes of the September assassins of Paris, and the Jacobinical butcheries of Lyons and Avignon. It was marked not only by the fervor of the Revolution, but by the subtlety of the League, and will long remain a blot upon the history of the Second Restoration. Massacre and pillage of Nimes. Nimes now exhibited a most awful scene of outrage and carnage. Though many of the Protestants have fled to the Convents and the Garden Quay, the country houses of Messrs. Reguriat and several others had been pillaged, and the inhabitants treat them with wonted barbarity. Two parties had gluttoned their savage appetites on the farm of Madame Frat. The first, after eating, drinking, and breaking the furniture, and stealing what they thought proper, took leave by announcing the arrival of their comrades, compared with whom, they said, they should be thought merciful. 3 men and an old woman were left on the premises. At the sight of the second company, 2 of the men fled. "Are you a Catholic?" said the banditti to the old woman. "Yes." "Repeat, then, your Pater and Ave." Being terrified, she hesitated, and was instantly knocked down with a musket. On recovering her senses, she stole out of her house, but met Lade, the old valet de ferme, bringing in a salad, which the depredators had ordered them to cut. In vain she endeavored to persuade him to fly. "Are you a Protestant?" they exclaimed. "I am." A musket being discharged at him, he fell wounded, but not dead. To consummate their work, the monsters lighted a fire with straw and boards, threw their living victim into the flames, and suffered him to expire in the most dreadful agonies. They then ate their salad, omelette, etc. The next day some laborers, seeing the house open and deserted, entered and discovered the half-consumed body of Lade, the prefect of the Garde M. d'Arbad Jonquet, attempting to palliate the crimes of the Catholics, and the Odyssey to assert that Lade was a Catholic. But this was publicly contradicted by two of the pastors at Nimes. Another party committed a dreadful murder at Saint Césaire upon Imbert Laplume, the husband of Suzanne Chivas. He was met on returning from work in the fields. The chief promised him life, but insisted that he might be conducted to the prison at Nimes. Seeing, however, that the party was determined to kill him, he resumed his natural character, and being a powerful and courageous man, advanced and exclaimed, "You are brigands, fire!" 4 of them fired, and he fell, but he was not dead. And while living they mutilated his body, and then passing a cord round it, drew it along, attached to a cannon of which they had possession. It was not until after 8 days that his relatives were apprised of his death. 5 individuals of the family of Chivas, all husbands and fathers, were massacred in the course of a few days. The merciless treatment of the women in this persecution at Nimes was such as would have disgraced by any savages ever heard of. The widows Rive and Bernard were forced to sacrifice enormous sums, and the house of Mrs. Lecointe was ravaged, and her goods destroyed. Mrs. F. Dieter had her dwelling sacked and nearly demolished to the foundation. A party of these bigots visited the widow Perrin, who lived on a little farm at the windmills. Having committed every species of devastation, they attacked even the sanctuary of the dead, which contained the relics of her family. They dragged the coffins out, and scattered the contents over the adjacent grounds. In vain this outraged widow collected the bones of her ancestors and replaced them. They were again dug up, and, after several useless efforts, they were reluctantly left spread over the surface of the fields. The royal decree in favor of the persecuted. At the decree of Louis XVIII, which annulled all the extraordinary powers conferred either by the king, the princes, or subordinate agents, was received at Nimes, and the laws were now to be administered by the regular organs, and a new prefect arrived to carry them into effect. But in spite of the proclamations, the work of destruction, stopped for a moment, was not abandoned, but soon renewed with fresh vigor and effect. On the 30th of July, Jacques Combe, the father of a family, was killed by some of the National Guards of Rousseau, and the crime was so public that the commander of the party restored to the family the pocket-book and papers of the deceased. On the following day, tumultuous clouds roamed about the city and suburbs, threatening the wretched peasants, and on the 1st of August they butchered them without opposition. About noon on the same day, 6 armed men, headed by Triumphant, the butcher, surrounded the house of Monod, a carpenter. 2 of the party, who were smiths, had been at work in the house the day before, and had seen a Protestant who had taken refuge there. M. Bourillon, who had been a lieutenant in the army, and had retired on a pension. He was a man of an excellent character, peaceable and harmless, and had never served the Emperor Napoleon. Triumphant, not knowing him, he was pointed out partaking of a frugal breakfast with the family. Triumphant ordered him to go along with him, adding, "Your friend Saucine is already in the other world." Triumphant placed him in the middle of his troop, and artfully ordered him to cry, "Vive Emperor!" He refused, adding, he had never served the Emperor. In vain did the women and the children of the house intercede for his wife, and praise his amiable and virtuous qualities. He was marched to the esplanade and shot, first by Triumphant, and then by the others. Several persons, attracted by the firing, approached, but were threatened with a similar fate. After some time the wretches departed, shouting "Vive le Roi!" Some women met them, and one of them, appearing affected, said, "I have killed 7 a day for my share, and if you say a word you shall be the 8th. Pierre Corbet, a stocking weaver, was torn from his loom by an armed band and shot at his own door. The eldest daughter was knocked down with the butt end of a musket, and a poignard was held at the breast of his wife, while the mob plundered her apartments. Paul Herat, a silk weaver, was literally cut in pieces in the presence of a large crowd, and amidst the unavailing cries and tears of his wife and 4 young children. The murderers only abandoned the corpse to return to Herat's house and secure everything valuable. The number of murders on this day could not be ascertained. One person saw 6 bodies on the Corse Neuf, and 9 were carried to the hospital. If murder some time after became less frequent for a few days, pillage and forced contributions were actively enforced. M. Salé de Hambro, at several visits, was robbed of 7,000 francs, and on one occasion, when he pleaded the sacrifice he had made, "Look," said a bandit, pointing to his pipe, "this will set fire to your house, and this," brandishing his sword, "will finish you." No reply could be made to these arguments. M. Feline, a silk manufacturer, was robbed of 32,000 francs in gold, 3,000 francs in silver, and several bales of silk. The small shopkeepers were continually exposed to visits and demands of provisions, drapery, or whatever they sold, and the same hands that set fire to the houses of the rich, and tore up the vines of the cultivator, broke the looms of the weaver, and stole the tools of the artisan. Desolation reigned in the sanctuary and in the city. The armed bands, instead of being reduced, they were increased. The fugitive, instead of returning, received constant accessions, and their friends who sheltered them were deemed rebellious. Those Protestants who remained were deprived of all their civil and religious rights, and even the advocates and hussiers entered into a resolution to exclude all of the pretended reformed religion from their bodies. Those who were employed in selling tobacco were deprived of their licenses. The Protestant deacons who had the charge of the poor were all scattered. Of 5 pastors, only 2 remained. One of these was obliged to change his residence, and could only venture to administer the consolations of religion, or to perform the functions of his ministry under cover of the night. Not content with these modes of torment, calumnious and inflammatory publications charged the Protestants with raising the prescribed standard in the communes, and invoking the fallen Napoleon, and of course was unworthy the protection of the laws and the favor of the monarch. Hundreds after this were dragged to prison, without even so much as a written order, and though an official newspaper, bearing the title of the Journal du Gard, was set up for 5 months, while it was influenced by the prefect, the mayor, and the other functionaries, the word charter was never once used in it. One of the first numbers, on the contrary, represented the suffering Protestants as crocodiles, only weeping from rage and regret that they had no more victims to devour, as persons who had surpassed Danton and Marat, the Robespierre, in doing mischief, and as having prostituted their daughters to the garrison to gain it over to Napoleon. An extract from this article, stamped with the crown and the arms of the Bourbons, was hawked about the streets, and the vendor was adorned with the medal of the police. Petition of the Protestant refugees. To these reproaches it is proper to opposite the petition which the Protestant refugees in Paris presented to Louis XVIII in behalf of their brethren at Nimes. We lay at your feet, sire, our acute sufferings in your name. Our fellow citizens are slaughtered, and their property laid waste. Misled peasants, in pretended obedience to your orders, had assembled at the command of a commissioner appointed by your august nephew. Although ready to attack us, they were received with the assurances of peace. On the 15th of July, 1815, we learned your majesty's entrance into Paris, and the white flag immediately waved on our edifices. The public tranquillity had not been disturbed when armed peasants introduced themselves. The garrison capitulated, but were assailed on their departure, and almost totally massacred. Our National Guard was disarmed. The city filled with strangers, and the houses of the principal inhabitants, professing the reformed religion, were attacked and plundered. we subjoin the list. Terror has driven from our city the most respectable inhabitants. Your Majesty has been deceived if there has not been placed before you in the picture of horrors which make a desert of your good city of Nimes. Arrests and proscriptions are continually taking place, and difference of religious opinions in the real and only cause. The calumniated Protestants are the defenders of the throne. You, nephew, has beheld our children under his banners. Our fortunes have been placed in his hands. Attacked without reason, the Protestants have not, even by a just resistance, afforded their enemies the fatal pretext for calumny. Save us, sire. Extinguish the brand of civil war. A single act of your will would restore to political existence a city, interesting for its population and its manufactures. Demand an account of their conduct from the chiefs who had brought our misfortunes upon us. We place before your eyes all the documents that have reached us. Fear paralyzes the hearts, and stifles the complaints of our fellow citizens. Placed in a more secure situation, we venture to raise our voice in their behalf, etc., etc. Monstrous outrage upon females. At Nimes it is well known that the women wash their clothes either at the fountains or on the banks of streams. There is a large basin near the fountain, where numbers of women may be seen every day, kneeling at the edge of the water, and beating the clothes with heavy pieces of wood in the shape of battledores. This spot became the scene of the most shameful and indecent practices. The Catholic rabble turned the women's petticoats over their heads, and so fastened them as to continue their exposure, and their subjection to a newly invented species of chastisement, for nails being placed in the wood of the batteurs in the form of fleur-de-lis. They beat them until the blood streamed from their bodies, and their cries rent the air. Often was death demanded was a commutation of this ignominious punishment, but refused with a magnificent joy to carry their outrage to the highest possible degree. Several who were in a state of pregnancy there assailed in this matter. The scandalous nature of the outrages prevented many of the sufferers from making them public, and especially from relating to the most aggravating circumstances. I have seen since M. Durand, a Catholic advocate, accompanying the assassins of the Foxburg Brigade, arm a batteur with sharp nails in the form of fleur-de-lis. I have seen them raise the garments of females and apply with heavy blows to the bleeding body. This batteur or battledore, to which they gave a name which my pen refuses to record, the cries of the sufferers, the streams of blood, the murmurs of indignation, which were suppressed by the fear nothing could move them. The surgeons who attended on those women who are dead can attest, by the marks of their wounds, the agonies which they must have endured, which, however horrible, is most strictly true. Nevertheless, during the progress of these horrors and obscenities, so disgraceful to France and the Catholic religion, the agents of government had powerful force under their command, and by honestly employing it, they might have restored tranquillity. Murder and robbery, however, continued, and were winked at by the Catholic magistrates. With very few exceptions, the administrative authorities, it is true, used words in their proclamations, etc., but never had recourse to actions to stop the enormities of the persecutors, who boldly declared that, on the 24th, the anniversary of St. Bartholomew, they intended to make a general massacre. The members of the Reformed Church were filled with terror, and instead of taking part in the election of deputies, were occupied as well as they could in providing for their own personal safety. End of chapter 21, part 1. Recording by Chris Curran.